Everybody, welcome back to another video. Mark here from diabetesdietguide.com. I'm all about helping people optimize their glucose levels and live healthy lifestyles. Now we have a lot to get through today because we're looking at everything you need to know about the gestational diabetes diet. And as you can see on the trusty board, we got a bunch of things to cover. So I'm not going to dwell too long on the intro. So let's jump right in and start looking at what it is you need to know about this diet and how to get on top of your glucose levels. Number one, glucose targets. Now your glucose targets are going to vary depending on what time of day it is. So as you can see, hopefully it's clear on the video that we have three different categories of your glucose levels. So the first one is your waking levels. These are going to be the lowest in the day that we're aiming for. And ideally we want these below 5.3. If they are above 5.3, it's usually because of the hormones your placenta is releasing, which interferes with how your body controls its glucose levels. So the common thing that people think is it's to do with what they ate the night before. It isn't. This is purely hormonal. Now don't get me wrong, if you've gone into the pregnancy and you're particularly overweight, or your HbA1c, which is your average glucose levels going into the pregnancy, is a little bit elevated compared to the general population, you're also going to have more difficulty controlling this compared to other people. But mostly it is hormonal. There are two things that generally sort this out. The first is medication, and the other is how active you have been. We're going to talk a little bit more about exercise later, but exercise definitely helps to lower these, but it's not to do with your dietary intake. Then we also have your pre-meal glucose target, which is ideally below 6. Now, of course, this is on the assumption you haven't eaten anything that will affect your blood sugars in between the meal. So this is kind of like another fasting level, but after kind of having your breakfast. So we have to take that one with a pinch of salt. And for me personally, I like to think of the glucose levels throughout the day as an average. And if you've eaten, then we can apply this third category, which is your post-meal target, which we want to be below 7.8 1 hour after eating. So this is where I really come in our gestational diabetes clinic, because we want to keep those glucose levels nice and tight. In fact, the overall control is very tight in this condition. And the reason is we know as you start to stray beyond 7.8 and beyond, the risks to baby, the pregnancy and the labor start to increase. So we're very strict with these glucose targets. So I really focus here on the post-meal results and also to a certain extent the pre-meals, whereas the medical team will obviously look at everything in a more holistic manner, as do I to a certain extent. But there might be a much more bigger indication for some medications if these fasting ones are elevated. And it also gives us a really good idea about how well your body is coping on its own. If you're waking up with glucose levels of 7 or 8 or beyond, then we know that already you're starting the day up against it. Whereas if all your glucose levels are below 5.3, then actually your body's not doing too badly, and therefore we probably wouldn't expect to see such a rise after the meals. Foods affecting glucose. So after that, we can probably jump straight down to number 3 here, because we've already covered waking levels. So it's understanding the foods that will and will not affect your blood glucose levels. So if we're trying to keep these targets below 7.8, then obviously there's going to be certain things that can push it over this. So just getting a general understanding of the different foods that will affect your glucose levels, ones that won't, and then also within that context of the ones that will, the better options for you, and then how much is too much. So let's jump right into that. So if we just turn over the page here, we've just written out the different types of foods that do affect your glucose levels. So the ones that do are called carbohydrates. And we have carbohydrates in lots of different places in the diet, but we can broadly separate them into 2 categories. The first being starch. So starchy carbohydrates, things like bread, pasta, rice, cereal, potatoes, oats, all are turned into glucose when you eat them. Doesn't mean they're sugary, but it does mean that they are turned into glucose and therefore have an effect on your blood glucose levels. Obviously within the starchy category, there's some other foods that have some starch in them, but generally speaking, don't have a huge effect on your glucose levels, like vegetables or beans, pulses, lentils, chickpeas, foods like that. Although of course, if you eat those foods, not so much the vegetables, but things like lentils or beans, if you eat those with these foods, then you can almost get a doubling effect, and so you'll be more likely to get a spike after your meal if you're prone to spikes. Then another type of carbohydrate is sugar. Now, a lot of people don't appreciate that sugar is in fact a carbohydrate, and of which we have two subcategories of sugar. We have processed sugar and we have natural sugar. So processed sugar examples include chocolate, cake, sugar itself, sweets, biscuits, those sort of really tasty foods, but also more processed foods that actually might think are more natural sugars, but when they enter the body, they behave much more like these processed sugars. So things like juice and jams and marmalades, sugary drinks, all of these are quite significant in terms of the effect they will have on your blood glucose levels. Whereas the natural sugars like fruit, vegetables, and also just to add one more on there, you have a little bit in some milk sugars. So milk and yogurt also have some natural sugar in them. Now, in fairness, these don't really provide a huge carbohydrate hit. These do, and these do. So realistically, when we're looking at a gestational diabetes diet, the ones we're really concerned with are these and these. And to a certain extent, fruit, depending on how much you're eating and how susceptible you are to spikes. So we know where the carbohydrates are in the diet, which means that we can start to address, if you're getting spikes after meals, which foods we need to start playing around with. Now, there are some foods that don't really have any effect on your glucose levels. So protein foods like meat, fish, eggs, nuts, seeds do not affect your blood glucose levels. Cheese is just fat and protein. It does not affect your blood glucose levels. I mentioned vegetables, they come both in starchy and sort of natural sugary, depending on where you want to put them. There's not really much carbohydrate there. You'd have to eat an awful lot of vegetables, and we're talking a lot, before they'd have a significant effect. So really, we kind of say vegetables and salads are neutral in terms of your blood glucose response. And it's also worth just pointing out, fats like oils and spreads do not affect your blood glucose levels, because I hear it all the time in clinic. People come in and they say, my glucose levels are high, so I took the butter off my toast. It makes no difference to your glucose levels really, because the butter doesn't affect your glucose levels. We'll come back to the effect of fat in a little bit. So now we know these are the foods that affect your blood glucose levels, and there are also some that have no effect. So already it starts to make sense that these are the ones we're going to start trying to reduce, and then we're going to start bulking out the plate with the foods that don't affect your blood glucose levels, ideally vegetables and lean proteins. And by that I mean the lower fat options: fish, poultry, reduced fat mince, turkey mince, eggs, those types of foods. But if you're really against having those types of food, I would personally rather you had a little bit extra fat in the diet from having extra meat than having high glucose levels in the pregnancy, because the glucose levels are going to be more risky than an elevated fat intake for a few months. So just keep that in mind. So if we just flip back here then, the next thing we need to think about then is what's the difference between these carbohydrate containing foods that are in your diet. Now, you might have heard of something called the glycemic index and the glycemic load. Now, all the glycemic index refers to is how quickly do these carbohydrate containing foods get into your body. Some will get into your body really quickly, and therefore you get all of that carbohydrate entering at once, so you're more prone to a spike. Some are more slowly absorbed, so you're less likely to have a spike. So if we draw this out in a graph format, hopefully you can see this. Something that's quickly absorbed will do this to your glucose levels. Something that is more slowly absorbed will do this. So it might be the same carbohydrate going in, but obviously this is higher than this. So the first thing we can do is, one, reduce the portion size of the carbohydrates. A good starting point is having only about a fist or a quarter of the plate dedicated to carbohydrates, and then changing the quick releasing carbohydrates to the slow releasing carbohydrates. So how do we do that? It's simple. We change things like white bread, white pasta, white rice, mashed potato, cereal with milk added onto it because it softens it up. It's really easy for the body to digest. And we change them to the more whole grain, the seeded, the brown varieties. If you're having cereal, it's better to have that with yogurt than with milk, because it's not mushing it up as much. Potatoes, don't mash them, have new potatoes, or ironically sweet potatoes. They are more slowly absorbed. Oats tend to be pretty slow releasing, but again, if you're cooking them, it tends to mush them up a little bit, becomes a bit more goopy, easier for the body to digest. Therefore, you might find that overnight oats is a better option. But keep in mind that regardless of the type of carbohydrate that you eat, it's still carbohydrate, and therefore it will always have potential to increase your glucose levels. Things like vegetables are very low glycemic index, generally speaking. Some are a bit higher, but we're going to talk about that in a second. And same with fruits, they do vary depending on the different types. Mostly the tropical fruits and dried fruits are the higher glycemic index, more quickly absorbed foods, as opposed to more like your typical English fruits or berries and things like that. They tend to be much more slower released. So we've got different types here. So there's two things you can do. You can change the portion and you can change the type. But there is one problem with this glycemic index, and that is that regardless of the type of carbohydrate that you're eating, it's still carbohydrate. So you can also have too much of a good thing. So we need to think about the portion of carbohydrate. And that's really what this glycemic load is referring to. So the glycemic load is how quickly does the carbohydrate get absorbed into your body, and also how many carbohydrates are there. Now a good example to highlight the drawbacks of the glycemic index is something like chocolate, because chocolate is quite slow releasing. So if you followed a low glycemic index diet, you'd actually probably start eating more chocolate, and something like watermelon, which is high glycemic index, you wouldn't eat much of. But in reality, when we look at glucose trends, chocolate's going to cause a much bigger spike compared to watermelon, and the reason is the carbohydrate content. So yes, chocolate is slowly absorbed because of fat. So fat actually slows down the absorption of your carbohydrate foods. Same with protein as well. So the more nutrition going into you, the more slowly the food's going to be absorbed. Whereas watermelon, yes, it's high glycemic index, but there's so little carbohydrate in it that it's going to really not going to cause much of an issue. So actually, when we use the glycemic load, really what the advice looks like is lots of vegetables, modest amounts of fruit. Try and limit the starchy foods to about a fist size, but also choosing the brown, wholemeal, seeded, brown variety types, and trying to limit these processed sugary foods to an absolute minimum. Then the other thing we need to think about is exercise. So exercise actually burns up sugar. So the more exercise you're doing, the more likely you'll be able to control your blood glucose levels. Now, usually we'd advise people to just go for a 10 to 15 minute walk after eating, because it really helps take the edge off their glucose trends and their glucose rises. Now, not everyone will see high levels. You have to be susceptible to high levels to get high levels. But if you're doing all the things that you can in your own power to prevent it from happening, you'll less likely have a problem. So the message with exercise is the more the better, within reason. Obviously, we don't want you out running marathons, but the more you can do, the better it will be. See this all the time with people that have active jobs. You can almost see on their glucose data the days they've been very active and the days they've been pretty idle. So just try to be consistent with exercise, and it will really help lower these glucose levels. Now, the other things I just wanted to very quickly address is a couple other things that tie in with all of this, I guess, but probably more with the glycemic index and the load, is you'll read a lot about things like food pairing to help slow down the absorption of food. So people will say things like, have an apple but smother peanut butter on it, or have a slice of bread but make sure you've got loads of butter on it, peanut butter, and more fat to slow down the absorption to prevent spikes. Now, yes, fat does slow down the absorption, and food pairing can be a valid strategy. But first, just make sure that you're going to get a high level in the first place, because otherwise you're just having a bunch of fat and a bunch of calories. And keep in mind that we don't want you to gain too much weight in the pregnancy overall. So if you're not having spikes just by having a normal slice of toast, then you don't need the fat on top of it to help. If you are, then yes, it can help, but actually it doesn't replace the basics of having more vegetables, more lean proteins, and trying to limit the amount of carbohydrates in the diet. So you don't need to be throwing a bunch of fat at everything just in order to get optimal glucose control. So if we just put this together in just some sound bites for general advice, it's going to look something like this. So key pieces of advice is, number one, track your glucose levels. So your team will be telling you to do this anyway, because then you can establish the patterns and see what's happening. Now, the hormones that we're talking about, those rises in the morning when you get those waking rises, potentially for some patients, that means that your glucose levels are probably most likely going to spike at breakfast because you have the most placental hormone circulating in your body, meaning your body's less able to control your glucose levels. And then in the UK, what do we eat for breakfast? Bread, cereal, oats, very starchy, carbohydrate heavy foods, and therefore you get a double whammy effect, so you might see an increase in your glucose levels. Now, if you're finding that you are spiking at certain meals, it doesn't necessarily mean you can't have any of that food. So let's say you have 3 slices of toast for breakfast and you get a high. It doesn't mean that toast is off the menu. It means that maybe 2 slices of toast is the way forward, and then what you've lost with the 1 slice of toast, you replace with something else. So like a boiled egg or 2. So we don't want you to eat less because you'll be hungry, and obviously you're pregnant, so we need to get nutrition into you. So always replace what you're losing. So if you are reducing the carbohydrates, replace with protein or vegetable-based foods. Much easier at main meals because obviously if you're just losing a few potatoes, you can put more vegetables on your plate or bulk it out of a bit more meat. Not so easy at breakfast because we're quite conditioned in the UK to be having those staple foods like the cereals or oats or toast. But in reality, you can have whatever you want at breakfast. Even like a healthy fry up might do the trick. Something like turkey bacon, chicken sausages, corn sausages. You know, really, you're only limited by imagination. Cherry tomatoes, avocado, eggs, they all do the job to reduce those carbohydrate containing foods and replace them with foods that do not affect your blood glucose levels. So that's the kind of mindset to get into. So track the glucose, reducing the carbs, exercise the tolerance. Every little helps, literally. If you can just get out and do a 5-minute walk after eating, it helps to just reduce those glucose levels. If you're seeing big variations in your glucose levels day to day, often it's a combination of things, but it can be exercise on that day or the day before was a lot greater compared to the days previous or on the day that you're seeing the higher readings. So just try and think about how active you've been. Other things that might affect it on different days is what time you woke up, because your hormonal levels will be different at different types of day. Your general hormones circulating in your body, stress, are you in any pain? There's lots of different factors that can feed into it. The important thing is to get a general trend and to see what's happening most days. So you might have a couple of slices of toast one morning, it's fine. You might have a couple of slices of toast the next day and it's gone right up to 9, well above target. So if you're finding that, then just assume that that food or that meal has the potential to increase your glucose levels and just be mindful of that. It's probably best then to actually reduce the carbohydrates, replace it with some of these foods, and just prevent it from happening on the times that it is going to happen, okay? So really that's kind of the top tips. So just looking at everything, we've covered the targets, we've covered the foods that will affect your blood glucose levels, we've looked at the different types of those foods that affect your glucose levels and sort of identified the better ones from the not so good ones. We've looked at portion sizes, how much is enough. Now with the portions, really it's going to be individual as well. So we said start with a fist or a quarter of the plate, but some ladies can get away with much bigger portions and they're absolutely fine. Other ladies can look at a plate of rice and their glucose levels go high. It's very frustrating for them. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong, but it just means that actually for you, it might be harder to do this with just diet, in which case that's where the medical team can come in. The medications that are used in gestational diabetes and pregnancy are very safe. They've been proven over a number of years to have no contraindications, and we only use the ones that have robust data. That means then that if a medication is assumed to be okay, but it doesn't have the data behind it, they still won't use it. So it practice very safe practice in pregnancy. We've also looked at exercise. So the power of exercise really helps this. Just keep in mind though, as the pregnancy progresses, you might find that you get less active. If you find you're getting less active, your baseline glucose levels might start to rise, which means you then need to do it more from the diet. So it's a fluid situation, okay? So just keep that in mind. And we've also just looked at some general tips as well. So I think I'll leave it there, guys, 'cause I'm just conscious this video going on for too long, but that's pretty much all the main points you need to really think about for a gestational diabetes diet. So I think we'll leave it there, guys. I hope you found that useful. Make sure you subscribe and like the video. It really helps us out a lot. and also turn on the notifications if you want to know when we publish more content. If you haven't done so already, head over to diabetesdietguide.com, where we've got much more information about all this stuff. It's there to help you. If you need an extra helping hand, we have programs and consultancy services available for those people that just need that extra helping hand. So I'll leave it there, and I will see you at the next video.